Let the Paguyrians now see our true strength. No amount of their power will stop us. Together, we will win, Valadin cried as he mounted the white horse. After a while, a dozen or so warriors rushed ahead, on the backs of their animals. When they reached the ranks of the enemy, the Paguyrians began to rush towards them, trying to stop them. One of the Paguyrians grabbed a spear to kill the steed rushing towards him, but the rider turned out to be faster. 2 bolts sent from Oscar's automatic crossbow, stuck directly into the cracks of the helmet, killing the fanatic. Late Lorcan caught up with his comrades and pulled his hammer out in front of him. His mount ran so fast that the warrior's scale armor began to jump on his body, like rag clothes. He raised his hand until suddenly the first of their heads was faceless. Enemies fell like flies in the face of the light-eyed newcomers from the south. Ustin, firing his bow, showered the enemy with arrows at a high speed and his running horse. By the time the mount had reached 20 meters, Hardrocks had shot the same number of enemies. His hands worked literally like a flawless machine, like a gun that throws bullet after bullet. Rushing past urns, he pulled out his white chain. "Catch it!" he cried out to his comrade. The archer, who had just used all his ammunition, immediately understood what his companion wanted to do. Ernst pointed the mount a little closer, so that it would be easier for his comrade to catch the other tip of the weapon. After a while, both of them were already holding a strained chain in their hands, which knocked everyone who was between their horses off their feet. Some of the Paguyrians, who did not have helmets, ended up much worse, because silver caltrops simply pierced their faces. It was not easy to escape from the 2 horse riders and their terrible chopping tool, all the more so because it was enough for those to lower their terrible weapon when one of them wanted to even down. Suddenly, something landed right next to Ulcher's horse. Black dynamite exploded, and the injured horse, treated with shrapnels, fell to the ground. Ulcher fell out of the saddle and landed next to the animal whinging in pain. His red robes plunged into the mud, and his fiery weapon snuffed out, falling into a blood-stained puddle. Not much time passed, and the warrior was surrounded from everywhere by the enemy. A dozen or so Paguyrians approached the warrior kneeling in the dirt. He had his face down the whole time and didn't even look into their eyes. Seeing this, the Black Knights attacked Hardrocks. Only then Ulcher raised his face in front of them. He pulled a bag out of his pack and lapped it directly into the ground, under his knees. As he did so, the mysterious thing suddenly exploded with white powder, which fell into their eyes and mouths. He opened his fiery eyes, and all the dust in the air burst out of the air with fire unexpectedly. The burned soldiers began to scream in pain and wallow in the mud to stop their torment, but Ulcher finished the work by impaling the lying men on the blade of his sword. "Their leader is not here," cried suddenly Igdi running next to him. A warrior with light, almost like snow hair, looked around everywhere, wanting to find a worthy opponent. He didn't have to wait long, because suddenly a fireball hit his chest. Unfortunately, the enemy spied him as first, which Hardrocks did not like. The man jumped off the ground and also spied a wizard standing nearby. "I'm about to kill you," shouted furiously Findrinin. He ran towards the hooded mage and threw his axe out of momentum, but the other man pulled out his golden staff in front of him and stopped the incoming weapon. Immediately afterwards, he used his power, and the axe magically turned in place and turned towards its owner. The weapon crashed into Igdi's spalder with a bang, and the wizard smiled at him, as if with contempt. The warrior, oddly enough, also smiled. Surprised by this sight, the sorcerer squinted his eyes, but not for long. They came out of place suddenly, when someone's knife stuck straight into his neck. The wizard spat on his own blood, and then slumped dead to the ground. Mikhail pulled his weapon out of his body and then turned to his great companion. "We must find their leader, come on." Tirefading turned back and looked at Kearney. "Where are you going?" "I've already taken you to safety place," replied the warrior. "You'd better get out of here and I'll help the soldiers here," he finished. "We can't get away from here. I want to fight with you. It is better for your Asletian companion that you leave this place. You don't have to fight here. It's not any desertion. Find Nanthornan and complete your mission better. I can handle it." When the brunette with brown eyes said this, he turned unexpectedly on his heel and drove his dagger straight into the throat of the Paguyrian, who wanted to walk in from behind. "Run away now," I said, repeated Hardrocks again firmly, to 3 newcomers. Tirefadin finally listened to his pleas. Together with Shtendrim, he grabbed the limping maidens and the 3 of them began to run clumsily, in the midst of chaos. One of the Pagungerian soldiers spied them and chose them as a weak target, but fortunately the Antherian knights rushed at him. The Pagungerian was not so pleased when men in red and silver armor impaled him mercilessly on their pikes. Tirefadin was still running ahead with his companions and did not even look back. A dead horse suddenly landed just under their feet, lifting up a wave of mud. The escapees quickly bypassed the shot innocent animal and trotted ahead, to the southwest. Whistling arrows and exploding bombs were a mere for their hearing, apart from the fact that their ears were simply sealed with mud. They were all covered in mud and other people's blood. In the end, they found themselves in the middle of a battle. There was no way to avoid a fight. Shtendrim was forced to make an escape route with his black, curved sword. They were trampling the bodies of dead Pagungerians, and just behind them a few arrows were fired. To their right were hundreds of fallen soldiers, and there were so many of them, that not a single scrap of pure earth could be seen. The bodies piled up literally like nearby hills. You could forget about the green grass in the fields that grew here. It was trampled and burned to dust, leaving not a single shred of natural colors. On a nearby hill one could see the Pagungerians, who, accompanied by their fossilized creatures, threw themselves at the Giretic archers. After a while, the archer squad was showered with wild fossilized monsters. Soldiers and disgusting monsters began to roll down from above. The Giretians looked in horror at the creatures, which had broken into small pieces, which, under the influence of magic, were still able to move. Tirefadin stared at it, until he suddenly slipped on the mud, falling straight into the red puddle. Shtendrim stretched his hand to help him get up, but suddenly he almost fell himself when he suddenly heard a monstrous bang behind him. A strangely familiar impact echoed throughout the area, temporarily depriving him of his balance. Three fugitives looked to where the strange sound was coming from. Suddenly, a great portal appeared before their eyes again, which was on the opposite hill. Suddenly, straight from the portal, shots were fired. The arrows crashed into the bodies of the Athenestian and Astrian soldiers, and Lord Hendron, standing among them, suddenly fell with them, apparently being shot himself. After a while, the vortex began to fade, but before it was completely blurred in the air, a figure came out of it. When Tirefadin saw the glow of purple reflecting off the fire, he immediately realized who the person was. "Go ahead with Mertens. I have to stop this madman," he said to the shadow warrior. "You're not going to win against Mirentagon. Let's run." Shtendrim advised him against it. "Mirentagon is dead. Now my job is to get rid of the order I once served. I will not allow others to die in my place," replied to him beautifully haired man, or rather past beautiful haired, because his head was flooded with all the mud. Hearing his statement, Shtendrim looked once more towards the hill. This time he noticed that the Black Knight covered in purple actually did not resemble the Mirentagon he had recently seen in an ancient mine. He found out that his companion was right, but after a while he pointed out something else. He didn't know if he had just misheard something, but he had the impression that Tirefadin had told him directly that he had to get rid of the order he himself had once served. Surprised by this fact, the shadow wanted to ask his companion what it was all about, but when he looked back, Tirefadin was already running towards the stony hill. Seeing that he had no intention of stopping, he grabbed Mertens again and began to run with him further ahead. Serema, seeing his lord in danger, tightened his bow to the shot. He let go of the bowstring, but the arrow bounced off the armor of the purple-clad Pagungerian. The Black Knight stopped and looked at the scout, shot in the leg. The lord tried to get up from the ground, but he did not have the strength to do so. A mysterious man suddenly pulled out a gold chain hanging over his belt and swung it directly at the archer. The gilded steel hit him so hard that Serema cringed in pain, moaning and falling with a swaying on his back. So the Pagungerian approached him with an axe, passing a chain around his neck. "Let me shorten you now by the head, you Athanesian worm. I'll stick your head on those funny arrows of yours, and your beloved lord will mourn the face of his great savior. We'll see if his tears are just as beautiful when I separate his head from the rest of that miserable body." When he said this, he tore the hood off the scout's head, and with the other hand he lifted his axe. Suddenly, however, someone dug his sword into the elbow of Pagungerian. The Black Knight's fingers lost feeling, and the weapon slipped out of his hand. The axe fell with a clink to the ground. Metkel snatched his blade from the man's hand and swung again, wanting to finish the work. Unfortunately, the Dark Knight struck the general with his other hand, covered with a steel fist. It overpowered the Athanestian in an instant. Metkel grabbed his nose, realizing that it had been broken once again. Blood poured profusely over his face. The Pagungerian grabbed him by the neck with his wounded hand. To the general's horror, his wound simply began to heal. "I see that another hero has been found," snorted Fanatic. When he said this, the black steel glove became as hot as a hot stove. Metkul began to choke, making muffled screams from his clenched throat. His body began to shake limply. The moans became weaker with each passing moment. "Enough is enough. Leave them and fight me, you coward. It's time to end it all," someone's voice suddenly said. Paguyurian quickly turned behind him, letting go of the choked Metkul. The long-haired general fell to hard ground, grabbing his scalded throat. An unpleasant whine came out of his mouth. "Ah. After all, you are one of Nanthornin's companions. What are you doing here? Do you want to join our order again? I can finish what I started and set you free," the Paguyurian said to Tirethadin. "Or maybe you want to fight on the side of these weak scums?" he asked moments later, hitting the lying Metkul in the face with the heavy sole of his shoe. Tirethadin gave him only a hostile look. "Tell me better what you want to achieve in this way," he said. "What way? Don't you know that this land belongs to us? It was here that we grew in strength. It was here that the history of our order began. It is time to eradicate all the Evanescent vermin from here and take away what is ours. I will set up my own throne inside the Golden Gate and dominate all the people of the South. No stupid shepherd with a tiny sword will prevent me from doing this." The Paguyurian leader began to howl. "I'm not afraid of you anymore. You will no longer be able to blind me with any magic or your lying words." "Ah yes, I clearly feel your fear. I feel everything, and you are about to feel what I am," shouted the Fanatic, turning the axe in his hand. "We're about to see how much power you have." A large weapon pierced the air. Tirethadin parried the first, powerful blow with a sword. "You're a fool to think I can be killed. Do not think that my lord is dead. He is in me and I'm all in him. You two could have chosen the will to power, but instead you chose weakness, and death." Tirethadin deflected another blow of the black axe, but his short sword bent until it was struck hard. The short blade began to buzz strangely, as if the weapon were just a piece of thin sheet metal. "You remind me of someone, my friend. My brother once looked at me the same way before I killed him, a gaze full of hatred and madness. I never loved him, and he didn't love me. He always envied me for being older. He always wanted to have as much power as I did. Even when he was dying, he laughed in my face." When Paguyurian said this, he snatched the unexpectedly damaged sword from the hands of Tirethadin. The green-eyed man felt the cold tip of his own blade on his throat. Paguyurian began to slowly lift the sword upwards so that his opponent could look him straight in the face. The Black Knight took his big helmet off his head, showing him his golden curls, long hair and blue eyes. The two men began to look at each other in silence. "Yes, it was you, my brother," said suddenly Goldilocks Man, not very touched by this fact. Tirethadin's eyes were only wiped out in response. "It's a shame Calipher is dead. It actually happens that he erased your memory. He was very close to me. It was he who decided to resurrect you and persuade me to become our servant. It was necessary to stay with Mirentagon. You have served him for years. With him you would still be safe and free from free will. You would still be filling our bright future. But you have decided to know the truth. Now you see how it can be dazzling. Take a close look at me. You probably don't even remember me. It could stay that way forever. You could still live in a lie and remain in the light of our Lord, but you have chosen the truth." Tirethadin felt the blade of the sword begin to prick him more and more in the throat. "You have chosen this weakness, and now, you wonder why you do not have the power to stop me. You have yet to give yourself back to our Savior, but your heart is too deceived by the truth. You are a complete fool, ordinary, weak garbage." Tirethadin could not even answer anything. He kept staring at Paguyurian's face, unable to believe what he had just heard. "Since I've been able to kill you once, I'll be willing to do it a second time. This time, however, you will never wake up again. If you hadn't killed Calipher then, and he had seen you go astray, brother, he would have killed you himself. I will revenge him and then bring my lord back to life. You have had your chance." Hearing this green-eyed man, he tried to retreat, but at the same moment, his brother pushed the sword forward. The blade wounded Tirethadin's neck, but someone did not allow Paguyurian to drive it deeper into the victim's throat. Seren was suddenly surprised the purple-clad man from behind, putting his head directly between his shoulders and the bowstring of his bow. However, the Paguyurian grabbed the scout's weapon, easily breaking the wood that had tightened around his neck, thus avoiding their attempt to suffocate him. Seren's broken bow fell directly into the thick mud. "You are fools," seeing as how the Black Knight did not finish his speech, for suddenly everyone heard a sound of horns in the distance. The 4 men standing on the hill, as well as all the armies fighting downstairs, looked west, from where the sound came, and numerous dwarfs appeared before their eyes. Thousands of dwarfs stopped in the distance, raising their silver-blue banners upwards. Immediately afterwards, clad in heavy armor and their blue, pointed caps, the warriors formed a wall of triangular shields and began to run, screaming to the aid of their allies. Oddly enough, some larger figures were also visible among the dwarfs. When the army approached, you could see mudmans, holding wooden shields in their hands, spears and peaks. Armor from lizard scales provided the muddies with sufficient protection for their wiry bodies. Only the Pagungerians snorted at this sight. Touching the dwarfs and these underdeveloped, humanoid mutants decided to help their poor friends in battle. I just wonder what they will demand in return for this support. Fortunately, I also happen to have my allies. My mercenaries will do anything for money, so are those greedy dwarfs who only care about working in your pretty mines and for your merchants. Saying this, he looked back. He did not pay attention to the fact that Serema was holding his sword right next to his throat. "Look, my brother, my people already know what to do. They immediately went out in front of your beloved acquaintances," he laughed, pointing to Etherdin to approaching the battlefield. 2 troops of Isletian pirates. "Are those Isletians? None of these robbers can resist our wealth. Our influence is growing with every moment in their land, and by the time they know it, they will soon belong to our power. The new king loved me really like a brother, not like you love me, Etherdin," the Pagungerian said, still watching the 2 approaching pirate troops. "It is a pity that your dear General Mertens cannot now see his people murdering you all, that he cannot see them murdering for their own lusts. As soon as they will learn of his betrayal." The golden-haired interrupted his speech. Among the Isletian ranks he saw a strange and suitable black figure. After a moment of reflection, he realized who this mysterious individual could be. "Well, some stray shadow warrior decided to turn against you, apparently. Every one of them comes from this wonderful land. And what do you think of this, my little brother? Even they know which side it is more right to put themselves on." When he said this, he looked at his younger brother. Etherdin smiled at him strangely. Embarrassed, the Pagungerian looked once more towards the 2 Isletian troops. It was only when a familiar figure stepped forward that he realized how wrong he was. Mertens pulled his saber out from behind his waist and lifted it forward, straight towards the stone hill. After a while, a loud Isletian order came from his mouth. "Matter and Los Pagurinos." The pirates, who heard this, suddenly rushed towards the hill. The surprised Pagungerians were destroyed by furious, treacherous mercenaries. All the Black Knights were completely trapped, with a stony hill behind them. The Isletians attacked them, crushing them to the rocks. The heavily armed Pagungerians did not even have a way to escape to the top, falling over on the slippery mud every now and then. Sabers and pirate bullets slammed into the backs of terrified enemies. The Pagungerian standing on the top watched all this from above and saw how all his closest warriors died like flies. The man dressed in purple, seeing what had happened to his entire army, went into an indescribable frenzy. There was not a shred of land in which his enemies could not be seen. Even all the heroists moved towards him. The Goldilocks man began to scream like a real, screeching creature instead of doing anything. He even forgot that Etherdin was still next to him, along with the furious scout. Serema, with a cry of triumph, unexpectedly cut the entire throat of the tossing man. The Pagungerian leader immediately fell silent, grabbing his wound. Blood gushed from his neck like a fountain, and his hand tried unsuccessfully to stop the bleeding. He couldn't get a single word out of himself. Instead, the mouth was all covered in blood. All they could hear was the choked noises that resembled screeching. Etherdin, seeing that his former brother was not going to give up so easily, dealt him his own blow. Half of the broken bow stuck straight into Pagungerian's non-covered armpit. A piece of sharp wood stuck in his body, stopping right next to his right lung. Etherdin twitched all over his body, seeing how brutally he had dealt with his own brother, but he was even more horrified by his horrible smile. The half-alive man moved away a little on his shaking legs, grinning with his red teeth. After a while, he fell to his knees, so Etherdin came to finish the work. "You, Phil, Navel, stop me." The Pagungerian walked out with difficulty. In Etherdin's eyes there were tears of sadness and rage. He lifted a stone to kill him, but the Pagungerian soldier managed to throw his robe on himself. Purple covered his entire face, and the man blurred without the slightest trace. Tirefadin fell limply to the ground, making a faint cry. The leader was not defeated, but his army fell. He knew it was over. The Black Knights, unable to see their lord, began to panic even more. They realized that they had failed. "Kill everyone, not to leave a single one alive," shouted Lord Minthril in the distance. "The death of Perugia, long live the South," his soldiers cried out. Chapter 53. The battle continued throughout the whole day. The sun, which had risen so long time ago, has now disappeared again without a trace. Far beyond the horizon, people began to light torches so that it would be better for them to find their fallen compatriots in the darkness, and the other of the soldiers, who had received new orders from their lords, prepared to recapture the great city, a siege that could have taken them weeks, if not long months. They only hoped that there was no one left in the capital, except for the grey-skinned creatures only. Then even powerful walls would not be such a big problem for them. The defeated Pagungerians, on the other hand, were tied up as prisoners and reluctantly threw their weapons under the feet of the enemy. "Thank you for your help. We sincerely did not expect your coming," Dobrumi said to the Gori, leader of the Blue Dwarven clan. "We could not stand idly by when even you decided to come here. This land also belongs to us dwarfs. The Ethnestians provide us with work and land to own. We could not allow these degenerates to destroy this good land. Let them regret putting their filthy feet here." Gori replied. The dwarf was so short compared to the Antherian that he could equal his height at most with a 5-year-old child. However, he had a more muscular body, of course for his size, so a small, steel hammer held in his hand and so sowed powerful destruction, especially if it concerned to the legs of opponents. All the Pagungerians who stood before the dwarf and wanted to face him ended up with broken knees and broken feet. However, it was not only the dwarf's weapons that aroused fear. His appearance was downright terrible. Corp's pale face looked literally unnatural. No wonder, since the dwarfs did not like the rays of the sun and hardly came out of their mines and caves, reddened from underground work. The orbs resembled 2 ruby balls, literally, like a vampire's eyes. "Mr. Dobrumi, Lord Hendron is feeling better and better, but he will not be able to lead his troops. He decided that you can do it. Lord Minthril will also take command of the rest of the soldiers," said Hendron's messenger suddenly. "Did he said something else?" asked the marshal. "Nothing. Nothing else he told me to say to you," said the fair-haired man, in his white official clothes. "And do you know what about these fanatics? Were all the prisoners killed by you?" "Not yet. The Lord decided that some were better left alive for a while," the messenger replied. "If they are not locked in cages, you better do something about it as soon as possible. These madmen are too unpredictable and too feral to keep them outside. Such beasts should be tethered, and it would be best to make cannon fodder out of them." The man began to speak furiously vaguely, but after a while he calmed his nerves. "Do not be worried, Mr. Dobrumi. The Asletians themselves took care of them. I don't know what happened between them, but these pirates act as if they were deceived by these islanders," said the Lord's servant. "Have you seen what these Asletians are doing to them? Have you been there?" Dobrumi asked. "No, I haven't seen. I did not have the opportunity to see what was happening there, because I had been ordered to come here, but I heard on the way that the Asletians were supposed to enter the prisoners' cages and everything had to be taken care of by our guards." The Antherian, hearing this, was scratching his head, as it was of course in his custom. Indeed, these pirates must be very enraged by something, since they betrayed their orders and helped us get rid of these fanatics, he noted. "Yes. They are very enraged. No doubt they got mountains of gold from their island colleagues, but they helped us, even though we are their eternal enemies. I'm not sure, but their general may have something to do with it." "General? You mean the Asletian general I saw? What was his name?" Dobrumi could not remember, this time scratching on his chin. "Mettens?" asked the messenger uncertainly. Yes, Mettens. Before all this hell broke loose, he was with another man in your lord's tent. I told Metkel to let them go and..." The misty-eyed man interrupted in half a sentence. "And what about Metkel, by the way? Apparently, he is also not doing well," he finished. "Is he your friend?" asked the servant. "Nope. I just want to know what happened to him." Dobrumi got upset. "He went to a special ward, to Lord's Dr. Selmfoot. He is there, along with other seriously injured patients. So it's something serious, said that one, but coming back to the point, do you know where this General Mettens and his comrade are? What is the name of his companion? Asked the messenger. Tereferdin, I think, Dobrami replied hesitantly, scratching, of course, on the head. I actually happened to have seen him at my lord's, in Selnovit's tent. He came there to see what was going on with him and medical, the messenger replied to him, until suddenly, oddly enough, he also scratched, put on his nose. Is that your friend Mr. Dobrami? He asked out of curiosity. Hearing this, the marshal knitted his bushy eyebrows. Why are you asking me such questions? He asked. No, I don't know him. He is not a friend of mine and I just want to know where to look for him now, he finished. I have already told you, Dobrami. A man named Tereferdin is now in Lord's Field Hospital, the Evanestian reminded him. And what about the Shadow Warrior? With him, too, I would like to speak. I'm sorry, apparently, he left here recently. It is not known where he is now. Are you talking about a Shadow Warrior now? Interjected unexpectedly silent Gory. Two men looked down at the face of the smiling dwarf. I saw him an hour ago, the dwarf finally explained. So where did he go? The Antherian asked him. Do I know it? Dobrami again knitted his eyebrows, but only out of surprise. But you said that you saw him, so you should probably know, at least, which way he went, he said. That's right. I should know that. However, as you probably know, Dobrami, the shadows disappear after some time in the dark, Gory replied, resting his hands on his big belly. David slowly opened his eyes. He blinked them for a moment, as if to avoid the dazzling rays, but there were no rays, only the bonfire next to him illuminated the nightly forest depths. Lying on the ground, the boy moved his hands, wanting to make sure that something only would seem to him. He didn't feel something. After a while, he dared to look at his hands, and in his tired, half-squinted eyes, you could see an expression of surprise and horror. His lips began to twitch. Now he could clearly see that he did not have an index finger on his left hand. The only thing left of it was a small, burned stump. The hitherto unconscious boy, who had been lying literally all day, did not feel even such terrible pain as the fire. He clenched his hand tightly, trying not to pay attention to this strange feeling, or rather the lack of feeling. Slowly, he turned his bandaged head to the side, and the glow of a large bonfire suddenly struck his eyes. When he narrowed his eyes to see who was behind it, his head hurt from the stretching muscles of his face. He was the first to recognize Nanthonin, but behind the fire, a few more people could be seen. His mind was no longer working normally. He didn't even remember what had happened and who was with him now. He looked around again and saw that Nethin was also behind him. Then he turned his eyes again, seeing that there was a dark figure standing over the unconscious young man. He was terrified for a moment, but suddenly he remembered the face of this mysterious figure. Shendrim, he asked to make sure. His hair, blacker than coal, and his pale skin covered with scars immediately reminded him of his former companion. The Shadow Warrior approached the boy in silence and checked his condition. Can you breathe normally? He asked. Yes. The boy mumbled. And nothing hurts you? Everything hurts me, my head almost, said the boy. And can you get up? The boy mumbled something only in response, after which he leaned back with his hands to get up from the grey blanket. He fell back to the ground with a moan and replied. I think I can, but my head can't stand it. Shendrim smiled slightly, then rest. He recommended to the boy, then returned again to Nethin lying in the back. When David led him away with his gaze and turned his head to the side, he was suddenly frightened again, seeing that someone else was standing over his bed. Nanthonin bended over the boy, and immediately afterwards, he sat next to him, on the trunk of a lime tree. You were lucky. It was only a little miracle and these stones might split your skull, just like all of us. You have been in a coma around the clock, and no wonder. You have quite a hole in the back of your head. You really need to sleep and get well. The boy who heard this was not even able to shake out his reddened eyes. What about Terhin? He asked weakly. He is all right now. He was more fortunate than you, Bago. He is with him now. And what about the others? The boy was still worried. Tereferdin and Mettens, by the way, will be not with us. Shendrim came here at their request and will help us go tomorrow to a nearby village. As for the king, he are not doing well, of course as a king. The others will also somehow get out of it all. but I have to go back to Stendrim and do something with Nethin. We had already given him the necessary medicines and cleaned the wound, but we did it far too late. When he will wake up, there is a high probability that he will be paralyzed for the next few days. His body, even now, is all stiff. The venom of this creature should kill a person in one day. If we hadn't drained his blood, if we hadn't literally drained his blood, he would have been dead, but now, his body has to fight the remaining bacteria on its own. Time, it is the best, doctor, the warrior replied. And what happened to my finger? How did this happen? David shouted in a trembling voice. Well, when I found you tangled in the branches, your finger was only on one tendon. I don't know how it happened, but it's a miracle that you didn't lose all your hand. Thinking by the view I saw then, Heroest replied. What view? The boy was terrified. You stopped right next to the sunken, sharp trees. If any of the branches pierced you, you would no longer swim to the surface, explained the giant. The boy did not answer anything. It was really a miracle that everyone survived something like this. Nanthornin got up from his seat and walked away for a while. He came back with some wooden cup, filled to the brim with something hot. It's herbal tea, I made it myself recently, from local herbs and forest fruits. Of course, you will definitely feel much better after that, he said. David looked at the tea leaves floating in hot water, and then he gulped at drinking all the hot contents of the cup, as well as what was left at the bottom. He licked up a leaves stick to the vessel with his tongue as if he were eating something of the most delicious thing in his entire life. The relief he felt in his throat after drinking this wonderful drink blurred all his sorrows in his head. Everything is bad, it went into oblivion, even the headache itself seemed nothing. Now lie down, you need to rest, the warrior told him. Nanthornin did not have to wait long. When David closed his eyes, he returned to the campfire to take care of the king and Jelith. The glow of the rising sun slowly pierced through the crowns of tall trees, illuminating the darkness of the dense forest. The forest litter took on colors, and foxes, rabbits and many other animals began to emerge from various hidden dens. The forest was again teeming with life. The chirping of the birds above intensified with each successive sound of footsteps, approaching newcomers down. The warrior at the head led his comrades westwards towards the nearby trails, where they could finally meet the local passers-by. David barely held on to his feet, even though he was supported by a huge friend. Bago and Tarin, who followed them, supported a half-alive ruler of Efinestra from both sides. Even though their knees were bending, the limping Jollyfessa walked past Jelith, and Poppin and Cordrin, who had been in pretty good condition after yesterday's accident, were holding a not much larger Terhin. Celian also marched in the middle, who was forced to carry Nethin with his sore hands. After about 10 minutes, the team managed to get out of the forest. They all suddenly fell to the ground, staring at the stone path at the bottom of the hill on which they were sitting. Jollyfessa leaned her right leg against the stone and with a whine finally freed her swollen foot from her leather, tight shoe. She touched the swelling slightly and hissed in pain, as if someone was tearing her tendons. The ankle didn't look broken at all, so the only valid explanation for why she felt something so horrible was the terrible smash of the bones. This meant that the ankle was not broken in the literal sense of the word, but cracked. She looked more closely at the swelling, until suddenly she weakened, seeing in the side of her foot an unhealed wound, a wound that looked as if someone wanted to cut off a piece of her foot. That should help a little, Stendrim said, pulling out a bag filled with weed from his bag. It can prickle a little and pinch, he warned the girl. When he said this, he crushed the leaves in his hands and rubbed the green paste felt on its swelling. The princess hissed at first, then began to scream in a frenzy. What is it? How it hurts, she screamed, tensing all her muscles, until her whole face reddened. Sometimes pain can only be removed by greater pain. The shadow warrior smiled. Take it better from me this, something, the archer replied to him. The young man obediently obeyed the order and left without a word. We have to move on. Not far from here, to the south, is the village of Elfratal, Nanthornin said. I can't do it, Celian sighed. We can do it. We will succeed, David said, rising to his feet. He took a few shaky steps, and then fell to the ground with a moan. He looked ahead and mumbled faintly. We just have to believe. What do you mean by? The scout did not finish his sentence, because suddenly he heard a strange voice. He turned behind him, and his eyes saw the most beautiful sight he could have imagined at that moment. People, people, he began to scream overjoyed. He did not notice that the caravan belonged to the dwarfs, but he did not care. He was the first to run down the hill, completely forgetting about his fatigue. The wagons stopped after a while on a paved road, and their owners stared at a man running towards them. "Who is it? It looks like he's about to die," said one of the dwarfs. "He looks like a scout to me. Do you think he also left the battlefield, Neri? He doesn't look like a messenger to me, not on a deserter either. What can a scout do here? Maybe he was ordered to explore the surroundings of the city and wants to warn us about something." "Yes, that would be quite logical. Some goblin remnants can still reign in these forests," said his companion, pulling the axe out from behind his seat. Meanwhile, the scout began to wave his hands at them. "Yes, you were right. He really wants to tell us something. Take up arms. We need to reach Elphatel and pick up the goods." The hooded man was still waving his arms like crazy. "What's going on, Scout? Are we in any danger?" shouted the dwarf to the approaching individual. "Help! Help!" the other one howled in response. "That's right. These creatures are chasing him," said Mary. "We have to help him. There will be a place for him in my cart," he added after a while. "First we need to find out how many of these monsters there are. We need to deal with them and clear the trail. Go out and get ready," ordered the guide. After a while, the scout ran to them and fell in front of them with a waist on his knees. "Relax. Tell us quickly how many wormers and goblins we can expect. How many of them are there?" the dwarf began to ask him. When he said this, he looked ahead, and some figures appeared before his eyes in the distance. "They are already here. Probably 11. We can do it," Neri said. "No. Wait, I think they are humans," noted the guide. After a while, he had no doubt about it, all the more so because the scout himself suddenly began to shout in his face. "Help! Help us!" Hearing this, the dwarf looked at the young man kneeling in front of him, who, even in this position, had his strange eyes at the height of his own face. He looked around at his companions, and then again at the approaching visitors. "False alarm, no monsters on the horizon," he told to his people. Half alive, David was lying with Nethin and the king inside one of the carts. The village of Elphatel, surrounded by an earth rampart, rested just behind the river. When 5 carts drove onto the stone bridge, the residents immediately guessed who the newcomers were. "Open the gates," cried a man standing on the shaft. After a while, the horses crossed the threshold of the gate, and a small caravan drove into the interior of the round settlement. People began to run out of their high houses and other colorful buildings to help the dwarven messengers prepare the necessary goods for the soldiers. When the inhabitants had brought all the collected tools and medicines, they all gathered in the stone courtyard. Suddenly, they froze in surprise, seeing a shadow warrior jumping out of one of the wagons. Immediately after him came the dwarf coachman, who hurriedly opened a hatch on the wagon. To everyone's surprise, there were more people inside. They couldn't believe their eyes when a familiar face came out of the shadows. The black-haired warrior jumped into the paved courtyard and stood in silence in front of the assembled crowd. "My dear friends," cried the dwarf. Everyone stood waiting, not knowing what was going on. "Today I want to tell you, dear ones," the dwarf said again, "that the great warrior Ninthornin has delivered to your homes a gift that will give us hope for a better future again. Hope for our victory, for peace and joy." A commotion of surprise began to be heard in the midst of the crowd. "Bow down before our king, Harin II, the Great," shouted the dwarf with joy, falling to his knees in front of the open wagon. When people saw a bearded figure emerging from the shadows, they no longer thought of any bow. Everyone began to jump up and cry with happiness, helping their beloved ruler to get up from his seat. "Let's thank our heroic team now," shouted the dwarf. "We must tell the lords of this good news. But now let's give our ruler and his deliverers warm food and rest," cried the elder of the village. The smell of herbs and flowers spread everywhere around the small room, and a pleasant, pine-scented smoke rose from the stove. Onions hung everywhere on wooden walls, absorbing all pestilence into itself. The red-haired woman approached Nethin lying down and handed him a silver cup. "Drink it, coal will cleanse your body a bit," said the herbalist. The young man looked at the coal-black water, but he could not continue to move, so she lifted his head and poured a thick drink into his mouth. Black powder dissolved in his palate, by the way strengthening his reddened enamel. "Now it can hurt a little," she warned, crushing on the countertop a mush made of garlic, onions, herbs and resin along with citric acid. She rubbed all the ingredients on a board and put them in a copper mortar. She applied ointment felt on a grey bite mark, and Nethin surprisingly did not even twitch. Apparently, nothing really hurt him. "It will be some time before he fully recovers," she told to the warrior. "For now, I think that's all I can do for him. In a few days the Lord Escort should come to you here. Maybe in Hedron someone will take better care of them," she added. "You did everything you could. Now time is the best doctor," Nanthorin said. "So Hendron's people will come here for us." "I thought we were going further south, to the Eternal Camp," said David, lying at the other end of the room. "If you wanted to get to the Eternal Camp, you would have to pass the village of Amber and then take a circuitous route around the whole great mountain. Then you would reach the fishing village by the lake and again you would have to avoid another mountain. Everywhere is still teeming with goblins. It will be safer for you to move west, through the city of Riena, and reach Hedron," Alet said, because that's what the woman was called. "Now I will take care of our Princess Nanthorin. I will definitely be able to do something with her foot," she announced. She walked out of the small room, closing a tiny door behind her. The warrior sat on a wooden stool, next to the beds of his companions, and rested there in silence. "We succeeded," the boy mumbled poorly. Malchediel looked into his face. "Yes. We succeeded, David," he admitted with a smile. "It's all over," he mumbled a moment later, getting up from the seat. He covered the boy with his grey blanket, after which he also disappeared behind the door. Chapter 54. It's been 3 weeks since the team was transported with the king to the giant fiefdom of Hedron. David had regained his full strength and celebrated victory with the others. All the lords were waiting for Lord Hendron, who was about to return to his castle. When he returned, along with Dobramo and Minthriel, the cheers of people could be heard from the castle walls. The armors walked along the fortifications and reached the main gate. The crowds in the courtyard shouted into the sky, "Our warriors have recaptured the capital. All monsters have been banished, and our people will not leave a single one alive. Peace will come again in Ethinestra," said the Lord in a loud voice. "Also thank all the heroists for how they contributed to our victory," Minthriel shouted. They all raised glorious cries. After a while, however, everyone fell silent. The crowd parted, and to the eyes of the lords appeared none other than the king himself. Lord Hendron came down from his mount and bowed before him. They all followed his example and lowered their heads as well. "You don't have to do that, dear ones. I have not come here to worship me, but to celebrate our victory. Bow down better before those who saved my life and restored the kingdom." When he said this, they all bowed before the 14 heroes with expressions of gratitude. The king also bowed slightly before his saviors, including his own daughter and old friend Popin. David stood like a balk in front of a multitude of people, not knowing what to think. Tirethadin standing next to them smiled, knowing very well that he has finally done something good for this land. Another few days passed, and people were still having fun. This time they all sat at a huge feast, along with the Lord and the King. There was no room in the mighty hall, but it didn't bother the people who found a place outside. Everyone danced until the very night, under the open, starry sky, and fireworks lit up the great walls of the castle. The children sat under a large tavern, seated on soft pillows, and laughingly watched the mudmen's puppet theatre they'd organized for them. All of them were masters in this profession. They often took their small, transportable theatres to jolly people from all towns with their funny performances. Bago and Shuffly were hired as ones of the puppet operators to tell the children how the heroic team saved the ruler. The story was, of course, a bit made up, but even Terhin himself, who was on the show, did not mind them. The story presented by the Mudmans was more colorful than the one he really experienced. The boy preferred to forget all that he had experienced and console himself a little, after so many weeks. Meanwhile, inside the stone palace, David sat comfortably in a chair, not knowing what food could be grabbed. He tasted a few fruits and dried bread and ate nothing more. After a while, he looked away and noticed that he was not the only one who got bored with constant fun. Metkul and Tirethadin stood on the sidelines, leaning against the wall, talking about something quietly. In solitude, David got up and walked over to his friends. "Why are you standing like this? You have as many declined faces as I do," laughed the boy. Metkul looked at him for a moment, then lowered his head again. Metkul still can't forget it. He has been having trouble with speaking since. Tirethadin paused unexpectedly in half a sentence. "Since what?" the boy asked. "You know," replied the beautiful-haired man. "It's about this, Paguirian," the youngster guessed. "Yes," Metkul finally mumbled briefly. "If he wasn't a Mirentagon, then, What happened to the real one? He asked immediately afterwards, in a weak voice. Mirantican is dead, evil has been defeated, David replied with a smile. He wasn't an ordinary man, I'm right? The general asked again. The boy surprisingly smiled in response. He was a servant of Mirantican. He has received power from his lord, but it cannot stop our strength. We have won against Paguiri and their power, and they will not do anything to us, he said. Apparently you saw it with your own eyes. Were you not afraid of him? Metkul became interested. Mirantican? David snorted. Oh well, I was afraid of him, but I didn't know the truth about who he really was, he finished. And who was he, if not an ordinary sorcerer? Metkul was surprised. Let's say he wasn't from this world, and neither the same as I. My job was to deal with him, the boy replied again with a smile. Hearing this, the warrior wrinkled his forehead, not knowing if what his little friend had said was true. Suddenly, someone's cry rang out all over the hall. Raven, that's you, come to me my old friend. David looked toward the open gates and saw Poppin and Cordrin running toward the sage. Raven Murtagh hugged the two halflings and then told them with a smile. You can't guess who just visited us now. The Lord himself will be shocked. They are about to come here soon. Who will come? What do you mean? Asked Poppin the old man. You will cry with happiness, my dear friend. You haven't seen each other for so many years, shouted joyfully the tallest one. Do you mean? The halfling did not finish, for suddenly he heard a stir behind the door. People were clearly surprised by something. After a while, the Antharian soldiers, along with Aladdin in front, entered the room. The Ephinistian lords, along with the king, rose from their seats, equally shocked. Hendron looked at Dobrami sitting next to him, but he, strangely enough, also did not look as if he was expecting these mysterious guests. Royal coats of arms, said aloud the Antharian marshal. Hearing this, the lord was as amazed. Could it be that King Sivergmund himself decided to visit them, and in addition without prior announcement? Forgive us, great King Horin, forgive us, Lord Hendron, for this unexpected intrusion. King Sivergmund agreed to his daughter to come to our celebration. Welcome Princess Ivanlin, daughter of the ruler of Antharia, and her husband Idiot. Valadin cried out in a loud voice. What, did he say idiot? David was surprised, hearing apparently another strange name. The gathered people did not even have time to raise applause, because suddenly, towards the royal family, about two halflings began to run. Ivanlin, idiot, Poppin shouted. Everyone looked at it with amazement. The soldiers, strangely enough, pouted before the two halflings, letting them go to the Antharian princess, as if they already knew them. Princess, is everything in? Dobrami did not finish his speech, seeing the halflings throw themselves into the arms of a fair-haired woman. What's going on here? Hendron was still surprised. Do you know why your princess came here, Dobrami? They came unannounced. I didn't give them an invitation until next month, he added after a while. I don't know what the princess is doing here. Apparently they wanted to surprise us, but why she didn't come here with her father in a month, at your request, I don't know, replied the marshal. King Horin, sitting on his wooden throne, rose from his seat and walked towards the guests himself. When he was in front of the princess and her husband, he turned to his subjects. I was the one who sent them an invitation to our ceremony, cried the king. Hearing this, Lord Hendron, his eyes were shaken. Of course, he did not resent the king, because his castle had become a kind of temporary capital of the ruler, but he had no idea why the royal, Antharian daughter wanted to come to them so quickly. Meanwhile, the king began to speak again. Today I want to tell you, my citizens, the ruler approached two halflings, that these two pop-dollies have already helped me regain my crown. Centuries ago, when my younger brother ruled this land, they put me on the throne as the rightful ruler of Ephiniestra. It is not for nothing that they helped me this time too. Jalafessa, hearing her father's words, simply froze. Now she knew why the king had previously called Poppin his friend, and how did Poppin know where the royal chamber was? Bring dear Bago here, bring to me all those who fought to defend my authority. It is thanks to them that eternal prosperity reigns in this land. It is thanks to my friends that I can exercise rule here. Everyone stood in silence. Harin and Jelif saw their princess lowering her silver fork from her hands. David, Tirefadin, come here, my daughter. Harin and Jelif, you two have saved my kingdom and my subjects, cried the king. David finally moved, no longer knowing what was going on around him. After a short time, the whole team gathered around the ruler, Nanthonin, David, Nethin, Pupin, Bago, Turhin, Cordrin, Celian, Shtendrim, Tirephodin, Harin, Jelith, Jalithessa, and even Metans himself. Bow once again to our heroes, bow down before Lord Popin and his companions, cried the king. Hendron felt weak, the golden cup slipped from his hand, and the wine has flooded his garments. Lord Popin, disbelieved some man in the crowd. I once appointed Cook Popin as a lord, but he preferred to live a calm life and rejected my offer, laughed the ruler, so I hope you don't regret it, Lord Hendron. Your kitchen without him would become nothing, added the king jokingly. The lord had not the slightest idea of what he had just heard. Through the mosaic windows of the great hall, the glow of the rising sun penetrated. Everyone gathered was dressed in ornate, beautiful clothes. Princess Jalithessa, who had already disaccustomed herself from her various dresses, now struggled to take every step, struggling to break through among the wooden benches, full of people. Her golden dress suddenly hooked on something, and the impatient girl, without even checking what was causing it, suddenly tugged at her clothes. When she reached her father, she sat in her large chair next to him and Lord Hendron. Her teacher Harin stood next to her, on the other side, talking with Metgal. They both hadn't seen each other in many, many years. Above their heads there was a huge orange banner, depicting the golden outline of the heron, which was indeed the crest of this castle. When the door of the hall opened, the king rose from his throne, and all those present people fell silent. Nanthonin and his brothers were the first to step in. He no longer wore any armor or ruffled shirt, but blue, decorated clothing, trimmed with gold and silver threads. When all the heroests lined up, the other friends of the warrior also came forward. David would stand beside him and with red face he looked around at everyone around him. King Harin came down from his platform, so they went forward to get closer to the ruler. The king, who had just timely received a new golden crown, approached the black-haired warrior, pulling his scepter in front of him. Great warrior Nanthonin, ruler of the mountains of the south, defender of Ephinestra, from now on, every inhabitant of this land will remember your brothers as his own. Let our homes be yours, and let your homes be ours. I have the power to give you now to belong to our kingdom. You will no longer be known as hermits and mercenaries, but as our brothers. You have defended this land for decades. Now it's time for us to reciprocate the goodness. When he said this, he touched both arms of Haroest with a scepter so that everyone can see. Such a sign was commonly known as the greatest sign of the covenant, as well as the blessing. Knighthood, which was of course done with the help of a sword, was almost nothing compared to this marking. Everyone applauded, and the ruler approached his other friends. Pupin, I know that you and Cordrin will certainly not want to receive any remuneration from me. However, if you avoid all wealth, especially Bago, as well as all mudmans, I can provide them with fur coats and good food for the winter. I know that muddy people don't usually seek any support, but these things will certainly have some benefit for them. I thank you very much, your majesty, Bago replied, bowing. The man stopped in front of another person. Nethin, I heard that since you were a child you wanted to become a knight. If you will agree, Selif will enroll you to his school so that you can soon realize your big dream. When he said this, the knight Selif stepped forward, giving the young man a beautiful, silver-black sword. Nethin picked up the gift and he smiled as he watched the amazing weapon. Although he had no chance of becoming a knight right away, he knew that when he finally will achieve his goal, he still will be in the prime of his life. Perhaps he will remain even the youngest knight in the entire kingdom. Meanwhile, it was time for Celian and Turhin. Serema probably for the first time in his life approached a 20-year-old student with a smile on his face. The young scout was given a long, decorated bow, along with a quiver filled with arrows. In addition, there was a silver badge on the pillow. Celian took it in his hands and stated that from now on he will no longer be an ordinary student of the bow, but a professional scout. Everything was watched by his parents, who a week ago decided to visit him. Now they did not regret anything. After all, they were proud of their son. That one was also finally happy with them. Finally, he could meet his little sister and celebrate with his whole family. Turhin, who once served as an orphan in the Eternal Camp, being a big fan of the scouting profession, finally gained attention from Serema. Jelif also liked the boy, which made her and the bowmaster more and more often meet. The woman took in the boy, and Serema became his teacher. Shtendrim, the king said at that time, from now on, you won't have to call yourself a mercenary. we will also provide you with a better future and you will be able to serve our land in our own ranks. Lord Hendron will be very pleased to have you among his best warriors. It is a great honor for me, the shadow replied, bowing before the bearded man as well as the lord of the castle. Tirefadin, I know you don't have Efinestian citizenship. I also know that you want to start a new life, said the king to a beautifully hairy man. Yes, my majesty, answered the young man. So I will provide you with citizenship and land to your own wherever you want, said the king, and then he turned his gaze to Mettens standing next to him. Everyone froze in silence, waiting for what was to come. The ruler, who knew a bit of the Asletian language, asked the pirate something. Unfortunately, not everyone could find out what they were talking about. After a few minutes of quiet conversation, Harin turned to his subjects. General Mettens decides to stay among us. He will also receive our citizenship and remain as one of us. His people will return to their homeland the next day and swear not to interfere in our war any longer, he cried. Most of the people were shocked by what they heard. How's that? Will you leave this pirate in your country? Lord Scanlan was surprised. Our eternal enemy is not the Asletians, but Asletia. Besides, as you probably know, Mettens cannot return to his homeland, otherwise he will remain disgraced, or even executed. The ruler of Efinestia replied to him. Most people thought that the king was right, and that the pirate could indeed remain in their homeland, but in others, words could still be heard, not hiding their dissatisfaction. The man who saw this, wrinkled his forehead and then looked back towards Mettens. Next to the pirate stood Valadin and Alcher. He looked around again at the crowd and suddenly began to quote some mysterious words to them. These will be great times, he began. Everyone looked at the king, not knowing what he meant. Times of abundance, peace, carefreeness. Our earth flows with gold and silver, the ruler continued. Listening to this, Hendron immediately remembered the words of the prophecy. Our sons will live with joy until death surprises them out of nowhere. All those present people, except Hendron, Dobromir and all the heroists, did not know whose words they were. They, the sons of the mighty, the powers will return. Kelin's descendants will follow his example, and darkness will give them power. The great city before the gate of gold, erected, covered with glory and power, will soon be lost and fall. The people of the mountains, ice and fire will be covered, and on the throne will sit a ruler covered with purple. The listeners were finally interested in the words of the ruler, but it is time to tell you, sons of darkness, the one who will put an end to your iniquity is coming. I am writing to you, servants of the demons, that you may know that from the gate of gold one of the elected chosen ones will come to meet you, a man from behind the worlds who will destroy you devils. People hearing this were suddenly surprised. The smallest of the smallest, a young man without glory will face your wickedness and lead the king of our sons to the throne. Peace will reign again and all will unite against the common enemy. When the king had finished quoting the prophecy, he approached Mettens once again. These were the words of the great prophet Lamech, a prophet and warrior who fought for these lands thousands of years ago against the people of Kelin and King Pagan. It was he who established the land of Efinestica and restored power to the rightful rulers. He was the first to destroy Kelin's servants. The prophecy turned out to be true. We all reunited against a common enemy and defeated the power of Pereria. He began to cry out. The confusion intensified. None of those people could comprehend what was happening. Meanwhile, the ruler stopped in front of a halfling boy. David looked as surprised as everyone else. Anastasia would be so proud of you, David, said the king to the boy, wiping away his tears. David was about to ask him who all this Anastasia was, but he couldn't say a word. He looked at himself and then again at the king, unable to believe what he had heard. I hope that he will grow as an equally good warrior, Nanthornin. Have him in your care and make him the next true heroist. The ruler turned to the giant. Nanthornin smiled at the king, then looked at his little friend. He already is, he said. Indeed. Valadin admitted. In the eternal camp it was calm as always. The lumberjack Maleficent was playing his morning melody on the flute, diversifying the chirping of birds. Sigrimatic and Selnovit listened to his piece while sitting on a nearby bench. Our king comes with the Lord, come, quickly. Some man began to scream unexpectedly, rising all three of them to their feet. When the campers gathered around the orange tent, familiar banners emerged from the western forest, held by Efinestian soldiers. People gathered from the town of Knittington accompanied the king and his army to the camp itself, also wanting to say goodbye to the heroic heroes. The ruler came down from his horse to the empty square, and his soldiers stopped behind him. Lord Hendron entered his tent for a moment to bring his great chair to the king, but after a while he realized that the two had been sitting together long enough. Rabban Murtagh also wanted the ruler to sit on his cot, but as they might expect, he refused. The king was still standing in the middle of the square, surrounded by thousands of people, most of whom could not see him anyway, because of the narrowness. "My beloved," Horin began to cry out, "we have all come here to say goodbye to our neighbors, who will return to their distant mountains today, for the first time in the history of our country. Let's wish them a safe return and hope to meet them again soon." He finished. He approached Nanthorin, as well as all his brothers, and he shook the hand of the warrior as well as David. Immediately afterwards, he summoned Hardrocks' companions to him. "They probably won't come back here soon, except maybe Nanthorin. Say goodbye better to your little friend," the ruler recommended to them. At these words, all of David's companions approached the Hardrocks. Pupin was the first to hug the boy for goodbye. The boy felt strange, for the first time experiencing such a friendly gesture on the part of the halfling. Immediately after Pupin, he was embraced by the second halfling, and then Bago. Nethin patted the boy in a man's way, and Celian, he began to cry like a child. Shtendrim shook David's hand, and Turhan gave him a brofist, as he had taught him. When he finished next, Metans came up and bowed slightly. Tirethadin stood before the teenage boy in a long silence, and all he did was put his hand on his shoulder, saying, "Thank you, my dear companion." Princess Jalith, seeing that he was about to burst into tears, sighed and decided to say goodbye next also with Jelith and Harin. All three hugged with Tirethadin and David, so the others approached again, doing the same. After a while, the whole team was in their embrace. "Hey, someone here seems to have forgotten about us. Maybe there will be some space for us," Metkul asked suddenly, leaving the crowd with Serma. The two men were again in harmony, and no wonder. The scout was grateful that Metkul had saved his life during the battle. All the cuddling friends parted suddenly, surprised. "Oh no, 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 no," David shouted, seeing Metkul stretching out his arms. As he could have guessed, the warrior had forgotten power of his open arms again. The boy's bones crackled. Fortunately, the hug lasted only for a moment. David staggered on his feet as the man let him go, and Serma, as if nothing had happened, also approached him, pulling a paper thing out of his bag. "It's for you," he said, handing him a beautiful plane made of paper. The boy's eyes were shaken, and then he accepted a gift, resembling the shape of a golden bird. David thought that there was all those who had something to tell him, until he did not notice that someone else was coming from the Antharian ranks. Amazingly, it was Dobromir along with Hendron and the royal family. Princess Ivanlin looked at the boy. Her light, long hair covered his shoulders, on which she wore a red dress. Bright eyes, similar in color to copper, were stunning. However, something did not fit under one of them. David involuntarily narrowed his eyes at the sight of a nasty scar stretching along her left cheek. He didn't want to ask any unnecessary questions, so he turned his gaze to her husband. Idiot did not have a disfigured face, but despite this, he looked less royal than the princess. Something told David in the mind that the man could not be born a prince. Instead of a dignified expression, his face had a beautiful smile all the time. His whole face was rather beautiful and handsome. He was indeed handsome, but this handsomeness was covered by this pretty smile. If he had his dark hair a little shorter, everyone would pay attention to him at once rather than a woman. The eyes shone with a heavenly blue color. "We both knew you were coming here, David. Anastasia promised us that we would have the opportunity to see another of the chosen ones one day. She wasn't wrong about that," Ivanlin said. David, hearing this again, had no idea what was going on. The only question was in his head again: who is all this Anastasia after all? The idiot, oddly enough, looked down in front of him and began to look closely at his face. "You inherited a pretty similar nose from her," he said suddenly. David wrinkled his forehead. It certainly can't be about his biological mother. After all, her name is Joanna. Maybe it's his grandmother, or great-grandmother, or great-great-grandmother. He no longer understood anything. Has anyone in his family already been in this mysterious world?